Hi. So with all the negative things out there being said about bisexuals and the way people think about themselves, I decided to do a series of videos about the benefits of being bisexual. And I'm not talking about the superficial stuff. I'm talking about the real benefits. So today, I'll be talking about how bisexuals will shape the future of humanity. And I can already hear you going, oh my goodness, where's he going with this one? Oh, it's going to be something crazy. But no, stick with me, because I'm going to go back to the beginning of humanity to explain my point very briefly. When we first moved from being whatever species we were before to the things that we consider to be humans, we were only a small group of people, and we had to procreate in order to survive as a species. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. People needed to procreate. Why? Because people needed to, like, the community needed to exist in terms of people being gatherers and people being hunters and people protecting from the others out there. They needed more children, and the species couldn't die off. So anyone who could not participate in the system was looked down upon. But the people who were physically capable of doing it but refused to do it was like a slap in the face for the species, and they were ostracized, pushed aside. You know what, kind of? Rightly so, because it's talking about the survival of the species here. We're talking like a long time ago. So the other thing that was dominant in those early humans' brains is safety and in being in numbers, and they could go, assumingly, because I wasn't there, if they were in a remote enough area, they can go an entire lifetime without seeing someone else other than from their own species of human. They could see, maybe they could see like people running in the bushes and they could fare and run and hide or something, or perhaps there was like attacking humans and that's the way they saw them. But back then, when there was a lot of space and very few people, there wasn't much interaction, so others were by definition scary. Of course it's scary because there are either attackers or potentially some sort of threat to you. So you had to participate in the system in order for the species to exist and have more kids, and also people who were not like you were scary. And those were rightful fears because we're talking about survival of the species. Now, let's jump ahead a few 100,000 years to the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution, which was, for the first time, the necessity to have children or survive as a species started to diminish. Why? Because people gained the ability to be able to walk into stores and be able to purchase things that weren't grown right there, that might have been grown distances away or made distances away. So suddenly you didn't have to have kids in order for the farm to go on in case you got sick. Someone else had to run the farm so that you didn't die, your entire family didn't die in the winter. That started to be eliminated because of the Industrial Revolution. But let's jump ahead again. Let's jump ahead to the 1980s, where something else pivotal happened, where it wasn't just the survival of the species that wasn't necessary to have kids, but suddenly the family, because at that point there became other mechanisms in which a person could survive, like, you know, places they could live where instead of being taken care of by their children. So suddenly you didn't necessarily have to have kids in order to survive. You could perhaps survive without, and if your kids didn't have kids, you could start to think that perhaps they could survive without having kids, you know? So suddenly humanity began to be released from the idea that you had to participate in this system for either your species to survive, or your tribe to survive, or your community to survive, or your family to survive. And you would think if that was the only thing that's stopping, like, let's say, bisexuals from coming out, then you would be wrong. Why? Because the other thing I talked about with the early humans was the fear involved. Everything that was other was scary, and rightfully so. And as time went on, you know, there was a telegraph and all these things that started to spread more information. And the more information that spread, first the scarier it got. And then as even more information came, the less scary it got. But even in the 1980s, United States, since that's an easy one and kind of like a leader in the world in many ways, in the United States, although the population was 225 million, there were only two main population centers, like two huge population centers, which would be New York and Los Angeles. But everybody could only get information from a certain amount of areas. The vast majority of people only had access to 3 networks and PBS. And a handful of people controlled what information came through that network, as well as a couple of newspapers, which again, a handful of editors controlled what was filtered through. Information was still very scarce at that time in the 1980s in the United States. For example, Russia was the evil empire. People were scared that Russians would come and kill Americans. That was the prevailing idea back then, if I remember precisely. And this was the way a lot of people thought in terms of fear, not just for them, but from fear of everything else. It might have been slightly different in two areas, in New York and Los Angeles, and you have to ask yourself why. It's because of the large population. It's less scary every time you meet someone who's different than you and they don't kill you. So in New York, especially, where there are all these people from around the world and all these people of different types of ways and different types of cultures, the more people interacted with these people, the less scarier that they got. The less other seemed scary. So in those areas, you had the fact that people didn't have to have kids in order to survive, the idea kind of perpetuating through the entire community, but not only that, people stopped fearing others. And that's why gay people and other people started gaining acceptance in that area, as well as Los Angeles. But in the Midwest, or everywhere outside of Los Angeles, New York, where the majority of the country was, it was still very much small town ideas where, there weren't a lot of people other than white and middle class like everyone else. It was still a huge amount of fear. Now, let's jump to a small moment in history that has shaped the rest of the world and the rest of what we know as humanity from this point forward, which happened in 1992 when President Clinton did something small. He released the requirements and made it easier for tech companies to hire people from around the world and bring them in and work with their companies. You might think, well, what does that have to do with anything? A lot. Because of that one small thing, the internet revolution happened. And what happened after that? Well, information that was once restricted by these handful of people that ran the newspapers and ran the television stations suddenly became openly available to anyone who wanted it. And not just what people wanted to get out, but people's stories. Individual stories started getting out, and other people started finding this and latching onto it. And people started discovering, Russia wasn't this evil empire. There were people just like us. And the more we found that out, the less scary it got. And the more people that understood that information, they were able to use it to combat all the fears that society has had since the time that we were categorized as humans. The result? A generation grows up with that being the norm, and every time they had some sort of question, if society told them what the answer was, they can go out and find on their own what the actual answer is, or determine that they're on. We call this the millennials. And this is why they're special, because they're the first generation that had the ability to combat incorrect information. So what is the result of that? The result was, looking at the United States, outside the United States, there's something called the Arab Spring, which is basically when a generation of people decided they didn't want what was happening to them, and they started creating a change. That's just one example outside. Going back to the United States, things like the first black president happened. Things like marriage equality, which maybe 5-6 years ago would have seemed to be like an impossible thing, suddenly became possible and suddenly happened. It's not by coincidence that there have been so many incredible changes that have happened in such a small period of time. It is because of the spread of information, and very specifically when it comes to being bisexual and homosexual and having thoughts and different sexual feelings. It's now we don't have a need to participate in the procreation to survive dynamic. So now you ask, okay, so all that's well and good. We all develop, things change and stuff like that. But what does that have to do with bisexuals shaping the future of humanity? Let's look at the bisexual's role throughout this time, starting out from the beginning. It was a requirement of everyone to participate in the system when we were struggling as a species. it was very important in order to have children. And bisexuals who had a choice of whether or not they could live a life doing this thing or live a life doing that thing, I believe made the correct choice for the species when they chose to act, in that participatory way. And as society turned into tribes, and tribes turned into countries, and countries turned into, communities and families, I can argue that it was very important in many, many of those situations for bisexuals to do the right thing and to participate in that system. However, now that that's no longer the case, and now that the fear is really diminishing on what others are like, the role of the bisexual is changing. And how much of it could change? I say let's look back to the 1950s. Why the 50s? Because at that time there's a man by the name of Alfred Kinsey who did a study, which out of it came the Kinsey scale. But in that study, he found that over 60% of the population had either a same-sex thought or a same-sex action throughout their lifetime. Over 60% of the population in 1950s, the height of American fear, the height of fear of Russia and everywhere else in the world. Even back then, he could find over 60% of the population to admit to having some sort of same-sex something. What would happen if he were to do that study today? With all the changes that have happened, all the diminishing of fear, how many people do you think he could get to admit to having some sort of same-sex thought or action? And keep in mind, I'm not talking about those who identify as bisexual. That's a completely different thing. Kinsey wasn't looking for people who identify as bisexual. He classified what bisexuality is, or a set of traits, and then he found how many people fall into that. Today, we have a large group of people who identify as bisexual, 3% some people say. There's then another group that identifies with having some sort of same-sex thoughts or feelings in a non-superficial way. Mostly straight people, they identify as, and they're 6% of the population. So that's 9% of the population right there. But how many others are like the people back in the 1950s who can admit to having sort of something, but still identify as straight? That's today. What do you think those numbers would be in a generation when more of the people who were afraid and repressing everyone from exploring, when they either change their minds or they die off? If it was already more than 60% in the 1950s, how big will that number get in 30 years? Bisexuality has reached a very important point right now. In a very short period, we went from being completely invisible to having television shows about us and us being represented other places. And we're still, even though we represent this large, vast minority, like a large minority, we are still massively underrepresented. But they're out there. And the less pressure there is, the more these people will come out just looking at the evidence of history. So right now, what we as bisexuals do right now will set a foundation of who these people think they are, these future bisexuals think they are, based on what we do. So in that way, we, bisexuals, will be shaping the majority of people in the future. We will shape humanity. That's the video. I hope you like it. If you do, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I do videos very frequently, but I don't do them on a regular basis, and the only way you can really find out when I do new videos is by subscribing. So please do. And also share it, because who knows who might enjoy hearing about this. Until the next video, stay cooler, my bisexual friend. Stay cooler. Bye.